The courtroom was heavy with a suffocating tension, the kind that pressed into your chest and made breathing feel like an effort. The judge, a stern woman in her late 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes as sharp as broken glass, adjusted her glasses and peered down from her towering bench. Her reputation for ruthlessness was almost legendary in the city. She had seen countless defendants stand before her, some arrogant, some pitiful, but rarely one as young, as seemingly ill-prepared as the boy now facing her. "David Miller," she said, her voice slow, deliberate, dripping with a sort of cruel amusement. "You have elected to represent yourself in a trial for grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Serious charges, very serious. Are you certain you don't want proper counsel? This isn't some high school debate, young man. This is your life." David stood up stiffly, the fabric of his second-hand suit, a relic from his older brother's closet, wrinkling awkwardly as he moved. His hands shook slightly, betraying the storm raging inside him, but when he spoke, his voice was steady, clear. "Your Honor," he began, meeting her skeptical gaze without flinching. "I understand the risks. I understand what's at stake. I've reviewed the evidence thoroughly. I believe I am the best person to defend myself today." A ripple of amusement moved through the spectators seated behind him. Soft chuckles, whispers. Even the prosecutor, Mr. Grayson, a man who seemed carved from marble and arrogance, allowed a smirk to briefly curl his lips as he adjusted his silk tie. To them, David was a lamb walking willingly into the slaughterhouse. The judge lifted a single eyebrow, unimpressed. "Confidence, Mr. Miller, is not the same as competence," she said coolly. "We shall see how far your self-taught legal prowess takes you." Mr. Grayson rose smoothly from his seat. "The state is ready, Your Honor. The evidence against the defendant is overwhelming. Eyewitness accounts, video surveillance, physical evidence. This should be an open and shut case." David's pulse pounded in his ears, but outwardly he remained calm. He had anticipated this moment, lived it in his mind 1,000 times. For the past 2 months he had buried himself in law books borrowed from the dusty corner of the public library. He had dissected every minute detail of his case, not because he believed the system was fair, but because he knew it wasn't. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting to be seen. The prosecution opened, painting David as nothing more than a reckless delinquent, an opportunistic thief caught red-handed. The jury, a collection of worn faces and wary eyes, listened half-heartedly, some already seeming to have made up their minds. Above it all, the judge doodled absently on her notepad, barely pretending to pay attention, when the first witness was called. "Officer Daniels, the arresting officer." David leaned forward, his mind sharpening like a blade. Daniels was a large man, his police uniform stretched tight across a barrel chest. He took the stand with a confident stride, hands clasped firmly as he prepared to deliver what he thought would be a damning testimony. "On the night in question," Daniels began, "I received a call about a stolen vehicle, a black sedan. Upon arrival at the scene, I observed the defendant, Mr. Miller, leaning into the driver's side window, appearing to tamper with the ignition. When I announced myself, he fled, resulting in a brief pursuit before I apprehended him." David jotted down notes quickly. Then he stood, his earlier nerves seemingly evaporated, replaced by a calm, deliberate intensity that even made a few heads turn. "Officer Daniels," David began, voice steady, "you stated you observed me attempting to hotwire the car. Could you please describe exactly what you saw?" Daniels hesitated. Barely, but David noticed. "You were leaning into the car window," the senator repeated, "holding what looked like a tool. You were fumbling near the dashboard. And how far away were you when you made this observation?" David asked, casually flipping a page on his notepad. "About 20 feet?" Daniels answered. David nodded, letting the answer hang heavy in the room. "In the dark?" he pressed. "Yes." David approached the judge respectfully. "Your Honor, may I approach the witness?" The judge, intrigued now despite herself, nodded. David handed Daniels a photograph, a close-up of the vehicle in question, taken during daylight. "Officer Daniels, can you please point to where the wires are located in this car?" Daniels frowned, studying the image. "Inside the dashboard," he said finally. David turned to the jury, his eyes bright with the fire of someone fighting for every inch of ground beneath him. Inside the dashboard, he repeated. Not dangling outside, not visible from the window. Hidden inside. He stepped back, letting the implications sink in. So, Officer Daniels, I must ask, from 20 feet away, in poor lighting conditions, with a closed window between us, how could you have possibly seen me manipulating wires that are concealed inside the dashboard? The courtroom buzzed, low murmurs rising like a tide. A few jurors exchanged glances. The judge straightened slightly in her chair, setting down her pen. Grayson jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor!" "Speculative." David turned immediately, voice firm but respectful. "Your Honor, if the prosecution's primary evidence relies on a physical impossibility, it goes to the very credibility of their entire case." The judge considered for a long moment, longer than anyone expected. Finally, she gestured for David to continue, and in that moment, in the thick, electric silence that filled the courtroom, David realized something profound. He had shifted the current. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was forcing everyone in that room, the jurors, the spectators, even the judge, to see him not as a lost cause, not as a statistic, but as a mind, a force, a person who refused to be crushed. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, the ground wasn't crumbling under his feet. And David knew, no matter the outcome, that he had already won something greater. He had proven that he was more than the labels they had slapped onto him. He was a fighter, a believer, and he was just getting started. He was a fighter, a believer, and he was just getting started. The courtroom held its breath as everything the prosecution had carefully constructed began to fall apart. The judge leaned forward, her earlier smirk replaced by a look of curiosity. "Overruled," she said, voice firmer now. "Continue, Mr. Miller." David turned back to Officer Daniels, eyes sharp, tone precise. "Officer, you also mentioned that I fled when you approached. Did you clearly identify yourself as a police officer before chasing me?" Daniels blinked. I believe I did." "You believe?" David asked, tilting his head. "Isn't it standard procedure to announce your presence and authority before pursuing a suspect?" "Yes, but, Thank you, officer," David cut in smoothly. "No further questions." Daniel stepped down, his confidence visibly shaken. Whispers echoed from the gallery. Jurors exchanged sidelong glances. The cracks in the prosecution's case were no longer subtle. They were widening with every word. The prosecutor, clearly rattled, straightened his jacket and called the next witness. "The state calls Mrs. Evelyn Thompson." A middle-aged woman with a tight jaw and eyes sharp from lack of sleep took the stand. Her frustration was palpable as she sat down and adjusted the collar of her coat. "Your Honor," she began, "I parked my black sedan outside our house that evening. When I woke up the next morning, it was gone, stolen. I called the police. Later that day, they found the vehicle with this young man inside it." David didn't flinch. He listened closely, already anticipating what would come next. When his turn arrived, he approached the stand calmly. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, voice respectful, "you said your car was stolen during the night. Did you personally witness the theft?" "No," she replied stiffly. "I was asleep," David nodded. "Understandable. When the police found the car, was it damaged in any way? Broken windows, forced locks?" Mrs. Thompson frowned slightly. "Oh, it was intact. No visible damage." David looked at the jury and let the silence settle. "So the car was allegedly stolen, but there was no forced entry, no damage, no sign of a break-in. How, then, do you believe the thief gained access?" I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe they had a key." David raised an eyebrow. "A key? Interesting. Do you know how many people have access to your car keys?" "Just me," she replied after a short pause. "And my husband." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. No further questions." As she stepped down, clearly uncomfortable, David turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness to the stand, Mr. James Thompson, husband of the previous witness." Grayson immediately rose. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. The defense failed to disclose this witness beforehand." David held his ground. "Your Honor, Mr. Thompson's testimony is vital to the truth of this case. The prosecution has had full access to both individuals since the beginning. If they neglected to ask the right questions, that is not my responsibility." The judge paused, studying him, then nodded. "Overruled. Call your witness." Mr. James Thompson, tall, fidgety, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of attention, made his way to the stand. David began, carefully. "Mr. Thompson, do you own the black sedan in question?" "Yes." "And do you have access to the keys?" "Yes." Mr. Thompson replied. David leaned slightly closer. "On the night in question, did you lend your vehicle to anyone?" A long pause, a glance toward his wife. Then, I lent it to my nephew, Alex. He had a date. I didn't think much of it." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened with disbelief. David didn't let the momentum slip. "So to be clear, your car wasn't stolen. You voluntarily lent it to your nephew, is that correct?" "Yes," Mr. Thompson admitted. David turned to the jury. "So the foundation of this entire case, that the car was stolen, is incorrect. The car wasn't taken without permission. It was borrowed within the family." Grayson stood abruptly. "Your Honor, objection, this is irrelevant. The defendant was still found in the car without consent." David didn't back down. "Your Honor, if the car wasn't stolen, then the charge of grand theft auto collapses. It's not a crime to be in a borrowed vehicle, especially when the so-called victim's husband gave consent. This isn't a technicality. It's the entire basis of the accusation." The judge said nothing for a moment, but the weight in the room shifted. The jury leaned in. The silence said more than words could. David continued, undeterred, "And as for the accusation of resisting arrest, that too is in question. The officer couldn't definitively confirm he identified himself before chasing me. If he didn't follow procedure, how can I be accused of resisting what I didn't know was a lawful arrest?" He took a breath and looked at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for logic, for fairness, for truth. The system assumed I was guilty from the start, but assumptions aren't justice." Then turned toward the judge with quiet resolve. "And with that, Your Honor, the defense rests. Your Honor, I'd like to call my next witness, Miss Carlin Wynn, a bystander present during the incident." The prosecutor stood abruptly. "Objection! This witness was not previously disclosed." David remained calm. "Your Honor, Miss Nguyen contacted me directly after reading about the case in the local paper. She has first-hand information about the events of that night. Given that the prosecution did not thoroughly investigate alternative narratives, I believe the court would benefit from hearing her account." The judge hesitated. The room was silent save for the soft creak of someone shifting on a bench in the gallery. "Overruled," she finally said. "Call your witness." Carla Gwen, a petite woman in her early 30s with dark eyes and a steady demeanor, approached the stand. She took the oath and sat down, glancing nervously around the courtroom before focusing on David. "Miss Wynn," David began, "can you tell the court where you were on the night in question?" "I was across the street, waiting for a friend. I'd just come out of the laundromat." "And what did you see?" David asked. "I saw a young man approach the sedan in question," she said, nodding toward the photo of the vehicle still pinned on the evidence board. "He looked nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. He opened the door quickly and got in. But that's not the man I see sitting here today." A ripple of murmurs passed through the courtroom. David didn't react outwardly, but his grip on the lectern tightened just slightly. "Are you certain?" he asked. "You're saying the person you saw enter the car was not me?" Carla nodded. "Positive. The guy I saw was shorter, stockier, he had curly hair. Looked Hispanic, maybe. He ran differently too, kind of hunched. I remember thinking he looked like he didn't want to be seen." David turned to the jury. "Mr. Nguyen, have you ever met me before today?" "No," she said firmly. "And you have no reason to lie under oath?" "None at all," she replied. David stepped back. "Thank you. No further questions." The prosecutor stood, trying to recover momentum. "Mr. Nguyen, it was dark, was it not?" "Yes." "And the man you saw was across the street?" "Correct." "Then how can you be so sure of what you saw?" Carla leaned forward slightly. "Because I watched him for several minutes. I was curious. He looked out of place, nervous. I paid attention, and I know faces. I work as a portrait artist." The prosecutor opened his mouth, paused, then sat down. "The damage had been done." David returned to the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, "with Ms. Wynn's testimony, We now have an eyewitness who directly contradicts the prosecution's assumption that I was the one entering the car. Their primary video evidence does not identify me, the vehicle wasn't stolen, and now we have a credible witness stating, I wasn't even the person in question. The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing. David turned back toward her. Regarding the charge of resisting arrest, I believe context matters. The officer pursuing me that night did not identify himself, as we've already established. I was in a high-crime neighborhood. A stranger in plain clothes yelling at me and running toward me? I reacted on instinct. I ran out of fear, not guilt. There was a beat of silence. I wasn't resisting arrest. I was trying not to become a statistic. The jury was utterly still now. One juror, an older black man in a gray vest, nodded, almost imperceptibly. David continued, I ask the court not to see me as a headline or as a case number. I'm not perfect, but I'm not what they've painted me to be. I stood here and represented myself, not because I think I'm smarter than any lawyer, but because I didn't believe anyone else would fight for me the way I knew I had to. He looked around the room, at the prosecutor, at the judge, at the jury. This isn't just about a car. It's about how quickly we choose what we believe based on how someone looks. It's about how justice should require more than convenience and assumption. It should demand truth. David let the silence hold. Then, Your Honor, the defense rests. The judge leaned back, her expression unreadable. The murmurs in the gallery swelled again, more urgent now, tinged with something new, doubt, maybe even admiration. The prosecutor looked lost in his own notes, flipping pages but finding nothing fresh to lean on. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, and David sat down for the first time in hours, hands still, heart pounding. The courtroom emptied slowly, the tension trailing like smoke in the air. He didn't know what the verdict would be, but for the first time since that night, since the cold metal of the cuffs had snapped around his wrists, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt hope. David nodded. The judge tapped her pen once against the bench, studying him. Very well, Mr. Miller, you may proceed. David approached the witness stand, the quiet murmurs in the courtroom dimming as all eyes followed him. He took the oath, straightened his shoulders, and sat down. For the first time since the trial had begun, he felt fully in control, not just of the argument, but of his story. Mr. Miller, the judge began, you understand that by taking the stand, you are subject to cross-examination by the prosecution? I do, Your Honor, David replied steadily. Proceed, she said. David turned slightly toward the jury, his voice calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take a moment to explain, not as a defendant, not even as someone accused of a crime, but as a human being who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. He paused, collecting his thoughts. I didn't steal that car. I didn't even know it had been reported stolen. I found it parked on a side street a few blocks from my apartment. The door was slightly ajar. I recognized it from earlier that week. It belonged to Mr. Thompson, whose nephew I had seen drive it around. I assumed maybe it had been left out or abandoned. I wanted to move it to a safer location. That's all. There were skeptical looks in the jury box, but also a few nods, people who were clearly listening now, weighing his words. I know how that sounds, David continued, but let's consider what we've heard today. The car wasn't hot-wired. There was no broken glass, no signs of forced entry. The registered owner didn't even know her own husband had lent it to someone else. He leaned forward slightly, hands clasped, and when the police arrived, when Officer Daniels approached, I panicked. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't show a badge. He shouted at me to stop, but all I saw was a large man running toward me in the dark. I thought I was being mugged. So yes, I ran. He let that sink in, then added, that doesn't make me guilty. That makes me scared, and maybe naive, but not a criminal. The courtroom was silent. The judge nodded toward the prosecutor. Mr. Grayson? Grayson stood slowly, clearly irritated, but trying to compose himself. He walked to the center of the courtroom and looked David up and down. Mr. Miller, he began, you claim you found the car and were trying to return it. But why didn't you call the police? Why not report it? Why not knock on someone's door and explain yourself? David met his gaze. Would you have believed me An 18-year-old black kid in a hoodie calling to say he found a car and was moving it for safekeeping? Grayson said nothing. I've seen how that story ends, David added quietly. I didn't want to become a headline, the prosecutor frowned. So you took it upon yourself to act like some kind of good Samaritan? No, David said. I acted like a scared teenager who didn't want trouble, but got it anyway. Grayson's face tightened. He turned to the judge. No further questions. David stepped down from the stand and returned to his table. He glanced once at the jury, then at the judge. He had done all he could. The judge looked at both attorneys. Very well, if there is no further evidence to be presented, we will move to closing statements. Grayson stood first. His statement was curt, his confidence visibly shaken. He reiterated the facts, the timeline, the video footage. But now his words felt rote, detached. The earlier certainty in his voice had been replaced by doubt. When it was David's turn, he stood slowly, walking to the center of the courtroom. Throughout this trial, he began, you've seen how quickly assumptions were made. You've seen how I was treated as guilty from the start. But you've also seen the truth. The car wasn't stolen. The arrest was based on a misunderstanding, and every piece of evidence the prosecution offered has been questioned, if not outright discredited. He paused, scanning the jurors' faces. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for justice. I'm asking you to see me not as a suspect, not as a statistic, but as a person who was caught in the gears of a system that didn't wait for answers before handing out accusations. David let the silence stretch. Then he nodded. Thank you. He sat down. The judge gave her final instructions to the jury and they filed out of the room. The door clicked shut behind them. David exhaled, the weight of the trial finally catching up to him. Hours passed. The courtroom slowly emptied until only a few people remained, sitting in uneasy silence. Then the door to the jury room creaked open. A bailiff stepped forward. The jury has reached a verdict. We have, Your Honor, the foreman said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his responsibility. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The foreman unfolded a piece of paper, cleared his throat, and began. In the matter of the State versus David Miller on the charge of grand theft auto, we find the defendant not guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. David's shoulders sagged slightly with relief, but he didn't move. The foreman continued. On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant not guilty. Now the murmurs gave way to louder reactions. Some shocked, some supportive. The judge struck her gavel once. Order. David let out a long breath. He turned to look at his public defender, who offered a small, relieved nod. For the first time in weeks, the knot in his chest loosened. The judge spoke again. Mr. Miller, you are free to go. This court thanks the jury for its service. You are dismissed. As the jury filed out, some of them gave David a final glance, one of understanding, maybe even respect. The judge stepped down from the bench and left the courtroom, leaving a swell of murmuring behind her. Reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras already zooming in on David's reaction. David stood slowly. His legs felt numb, like they didn't quite believe he was free yet. He looked around the courtroom, at the prosecution table, now empty, at the rows of strangers who had watched his every move, at Mr. Thompson, who sat hunched in the gallery beside his wife, not making eye contact with anyone. Then David's eyes landed on Alex, who was seated near the back. The boy looked down at his hands, guilt etched deep into his young features. David gave him a subtle nod, one of acknowledgement, not blame. Alex looked up, surprised, and gave a small nod back. Outside the courthouse, the steps were crowded with journalists shouting his name. Microphones were shoved toward him, cameras flashing in every direction. But David said nothing. He walked down the steps slowly, calmly, his head held high. He'd spoken enough. It wasn't until he turned the corner and reached a quiet side street that the weight of everything hit him at once. His knees buckled slightly, and he leaned against a building to steady himself. Free. He was free. He took out his phone and dialed a number. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. Mom? David? Oh my God, are you okay? I'm okay, he said. His voice cracked, but he smiled. It's over. I won. There was a pause, then soft sobbing on the other end. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. He closed his eyes. "I'll be home soon." That night, David sat in his room, the court transcripts and printouts of legal statutes still spread out on his desk. He stared at them for a long time, then began to gather them up. But just as he reached for the last sheet, he paused. Something inside him said, "Not yet." The trial had changed him. What began as a desperate fight for freedom had turned into something else, something bigger. He had uncovered lies, exposed assumptions, and forced the system to see him not as a suspect, but as a person. And in doing so, he had found something he never expected: purpose. Over the next few weeks, David began volunteering at a local community legal aid center. He started sitting in on hearings, assisting others with their paperwork, even giving advice to people who couldn't afford lawyers. His name began to circulate, not as the defendant in a sensational trial, but as the young man who stood up to the system and walked away stronger. One day, while helping a woman file an appeal, the supervising attorney looked at him and said, "You ever think about law school?" David smiled. "Every day." She handed him a brochure. "You've got the fire. Don't let it burn out." Years later, David would stand in a courtroom again, this time in a suit, behind a different table, with a law degree on his wall and clients who trusted him. He would use his voice not just to defend himself, but to defend others. But even as he rose through the ranks, even as he built a name for himself as a defender of the wrongly accused, he never forgot the courtroom where it all began. The courtroom where a scared teenager spoke the truth and was finally heard. And for David, this was just the beginning. He spent the following days in quiet reflection, the courtroom victory still fresh in his mind. Though the noise of the trial had faded, its impact echoed within him. The headlines had moved on, but something in David had shifted permanently. For the first time in his life, he felt seen, not just as a name on a docket or a suspect in a police report, but as a person with a voice, a purpose, and a future. Back at home, he sifted through the stacks of legal books, case files, and handwritten notes that had become his world over the past several weeks. He couldn't bring himself to throw them away. These weren't just papers. They were evidence of the journey he had taken, from a wrongly accused man to someone capable of defending himself with clarity and conviction. One evening, while helping his younger sister with a school essay, she paused and looked at him with admiration. "Do you think I could be a lawyer too?" she asked. David smiled, his heart swelling. "You can be anything you want," he replied, "as long as you're ready to fight for it." That moment stuck with him. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about being a symbol, proof that justice wasn't reserved for the privileged. He had wrestled with a system that almost swallowed him whole, and walked away not only intact, but stronger. Motivated by this, David began volunteering at a local community center that offered legal assistance to underrepresented individuals. At first, he just helped organize documents or explain court dates, but soon people started coming to him directly. Word spread fast about the young man who beat his own case, and now spent his time helping others do the same. He met a single mother facing eviction who didn't understand her rights, a teenage boy arrested for loitering who had no one to speak for him, a veteran denied his benefits due to a clerical error. David listened. He researched. He fought in court just yet, but in the trenches where the system quietly failed the people who needed it most. An afternoon, while reviewing documents in a cluttered back room of the center, he received a letter in the mail. It was from the judge who had presided over his trial. Her handwriting was neat, professional, but the tone was personal. "Mr. Miller," it read, "you reminded this courtroom, and me, why the justice system must never stop evolving. If you're serious about law school, I'd like to offer you a letter of recommendation. We need more advocates like you, not just in theory, but in action. Let me know how I can help." David sat in stunned silence for a moment, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The woman who once viewed him as a criminal now saw him as an ally to the truth. That kind of shift didn't happen often, but he had earned it. And so, with quiet determination, David began the next phase of his journey. He enrolled in night classes at the local college while continuing his work at the legal aid center. He studied long after others had gone to sleep, fueled by coffee and conviction. His free time disappeared, replaced by lectures, exams, and legal clinics, but he didn't mind. Every page he read, every case he dissected felt like a step toward the world he wanted to build. Years passed, and David didn't just attend law school, he thrived there. Professors praised his insight, students sought him out for study groups, and internship offers poured in. But David never forgot his roots. He turned down corporate firms in favor of a small defense practice that specialized in wrongful convictions. He knew where he was needed most. One day, now attorney David Miller stood in a courtroom once again. A young man stood beside him, shackled and terrified, wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit. David placed a reassuring hand on the client's shoulder and turned toward the jury. He was no longer the one on trial. He was the advocate, the protector, the voice. And as he began his opening statement, his voice was steady, powerful, filled with the kind of authority that only comes from lived experience. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this is not just about what happened on one night. It's about what happens every day in courtrooms like this across the country, when assumptions replace evidence and fear replaces justice. But not today. Today we speak the truth." In that moment, David knew this wasn't just the next chapter, it was his calling.